Now to military reorganization. The growing political unity in ancient Greece was especially visible in the military field. Whereas the Homeric heroes fought individual duels, by about 700 BC, Greek citizens were beginning to troop out for battle in a tight block of infantry called the phalanx. The members of a phalanx were heavily armored with bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, and round shield, and carried a long spear as well as a short sword. In battle, these hoplites, the individuals, the group was a phalanx, the individuals were the hoplites. The hoplites stood several men deep, so as to give greater weight and moral support when one phalanx pushed at another on level ground. The role of the general now was to determine when his troops were ready to give battle. Before the fray, he encouraged his soldiers by proper religious rites and exhortation, but in the action, maneuvers were almost impossible, since each man provided his own armor. The men of property, both aristocrats and the middling farmers, formed the major defense of the state. They were aided by a few light armored troops on the flanks, and the richer nobles were proud of their horses. Now, it mentions the horses there. Cavalry remained very weak in the absence of good forage. In coastal communities, simple warships appeared and were rowed by lower classes, because sails were bad at the time. Well, let's talk about horses for just a second. They have some engravings on the Acropolis and other places. They have engravings in Greek sculpture where the horses are pulling or whatever, and they have their heads majestically straight up in this weird fashion. And for a long time it was just admired as the classical Greek thing. They have realized that it was the harnesses they used, and the harnesses hold right here on the horse and cut its esophagus off. So horses were useless in agricultural work because they hadn't developed a proper harness yet. They just adapted. They took the ox thing and put it on a horse. They're really, really fast though. I mean, an ox doesn't go fast or slow, it just goes forward. So to have a horse is very important, because it's a significant status symbol. It says, I can afford to feed, I have enough land or whatever, can grow enough grain or buy enough to feed 3 horses or 5 or 7 or whatever. Horses were an important status symbol because they were useless. It mentions later Veblen, those of you who know Veblen. But continuing. In the coastal communities, simple warships appeared and were rowed by the lower classes. I mentioned the growth and the importance of technology in horses. What about the growth in the technology of sails? If you were to rig an ancient ship with a full canvas from a modern vessel, by modern I mean post-1500s, give a full set of canvas to an ancient vessel, the thing would destroy itself, would tip over or something. Initially, both the style of armor and the pattern of fighting were adaptations of military developments in the Near East, what we call the Middle East. But the spiritual cohesiveness of a Greek polis, as well as the intellectual ferment of its civilization, gave its warriors a strength far beyond their numbers. Quote, "It is not stones, nor timber, nor the craft of craftsmen, but wherever there are men knowing how to defend themselves, there are walls and a city." End quote. So much for the idea that building defenses leads to war. Building defenses ends war. Beginnings of Greek political history, 750 to 600. During the Dark Ages, there had been no political history as such. Not only do we lack any written records for the era, but also conscious political organization was absent. Now, I mean, it's just like Joe's in power. If he doesn't even have any coherent policies or ideas, he's not even part of this or that political camp. Mike took over power. And then after him, Don took power. Don killed Mike. Like the history of England in the 1100s, 1200s, and 1300s. Queen took over, and that queen wanted to take power, and this king and these people killed this guy and kidnapped her, held a gun to this lady's belly. That happened. Until philosophy enters the field, there's no reason to write down which guy has power, because it's just who has power. There was no political history as such. Conscious political organization was absent. Once the polis had emerged, its firmer political and military organization permitted more deliberate political action, and the growth of population made states more contentious over prize bits of farmland on the frontiers. So the more population there gets, the more valuable farmland gets. This is an age when every single inch of useful soil is very important. States were more contentious over prize bits of farmland on their frontiers. The first great war of which we know was fought just before the year 700 by Chalkis and Eretria to determine possession of the small but rich Lelantine plain. Many states far afield from Euboea, such as Samos and Miletus in the eastern Aegean, and Corinth and Megara on the Saronic Gulf, were drawn into this clash by their commercial rivalries and local antipathies. In the end, Chalkis was successful. That's interesting. Big war, world war for all intents and purposes in ancient Greece. So we've seen the first big war over agricultural area. We're not going to look at any more about that. We're just going to say that there was a lot of war, but from about the year 500 onwards, quote, the Greek states did not press severely and continuously upon one another. So there was war up to about the year 500. A lot of internecine war. Then it was less so, but it continued forever. Internally, at least, the rise of the polis brought order and security, though piracy on the seas and brigandage in the mountains remained enduring problems. In times of emergency, such as the Persian Wars, some of the major states, but not all, were able to group themselves in a common bond for the common moment of peril. In the long run, however, the division of Greece into many sovereign units, each jealously patriotic, was a terrific burden to which its fall was partly attributable. To understand Greek history, it must be remembered that Greece was a geographical expression, not a united country. All the Hellenes worshipped the same gods, shared the same basic culture, and met periodically in great international festivals and games, but this cultural unity meant no more politically than has the common cultural outlook of the Western European states in modern times, and they certainly have not been very friendly even with their common cultural outlook, have they? Consecutive internal development also began slowly to be evident once the polis had emerged and the writing of laws and other documents became customary. Once you start writing stuff down, it really gets serious. Quote, at Athens and Sparta, where our evidence is fuller, we can see something of the constitutional evolution of these states going back into the 7th century. We won't look at all that now. Sometimes the stresses became so severe that regular constitutional processes were interrupted by the rise of dictators who were called tyrants. So here we're going to do a bit about this, and we'll hear more about tyrants later as well in Hellenic History by Botsford and Robinson. Tyrants appeared chiefly in the more advanced states and gained their dominance usually when an oppressive aristocracy was badly split into factions. The tyrant himself was an ambitious member of the upper classes. But here's what I was saying earlier. He improves things. Strange. Once in power, he tended to curtail the economic and social privileges of his peers. So this is just a culture where in order to get into power, you have to do something limiting and damaging to the upper classes in favor of the lower classes, in certain senses. Now,